Hopefully you're not flying.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Leading in a Crisis podcast. I'm your host, Tom Mueller. On this podcast, we talk all things crisis management, and we do that through interviews, storytelling, and lessons learned from crisis leaders. With me today is my co-host, Mark Mullen. Mark, welcome.
I'm out. Phone's ringing.
That's why we want to switch off those phones. All right, I'm not sure what happened to Mark. Jeff, you're still with me, right?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just carry on. Hopefully Mark jumps back in with us.
I am now here. I just figured out how to turn. I'm not at my home. I'm at someone else's home and had to find the phone and then figure out how to turn it off.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
All right. Mark, let's just start with you saying, hi, Tom, glad to be here.
Hi, Tom. Glad to be here.
All right. Hey, with us today, we have a very special guest from the shipping world, Jeff Johnson. Jeff has a long history working in the shipping business, and he'll fill us in on that in just a minute. But started off sailing on ships on the West Coast, and then currently today is serving as president of the Cook Inlet Barge and Tug Company out of Alaska. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, happy to be here.
Good. I know you're a native Alaskan, so does it feel good being back in Alaska to work with the Tug and Barge Company?
It is. I've been blessed across my career to work across the world, but I've always had my sights on returning home, and it's nice to be home. And for the last 4 years, I've been living the dream, running one of the greatest tug companies in the United States and living in Alaska.
Well, that just sounds like as good as it gets right there. Well, Jeff, one of the things we like to do on this podcast is let guests sort of introduce yourself a little bit. So if you're meeting somebody for the first time and just doing a quick intro of your experience and life, what would that sound like?
Well, I'd probably start with being fourth generation Alaskan, raised up here, pioneering families, a pioneering family that really ventured into the commercial fishing world. And I started as a commercial fisherman. My love of the sea began there, and I worked my way up sailing on oil tankers around the world, but primarily U.S. West Coast out of Valdez. Opportunities then, as I grew older and had a family, to come ashore and take on various shore roles, both based in Washington State, Houston, Alaska, and in Singapore. So most recently, I left a role in Singapore 4 years ago to come home and be back in Alaska, and loving every minute of it.
Wow, you're a true world traveler by boat and by airplane. So sounds like a terrific career.
I look back and I'm truly blessed, and I can't think of anything I would change. It's been a great journey, and it continues to be.
Well, good. And, we're going to delve into your crisis experience a little bit as we continue our conversation. And, but I want to just kind of start, just kind of ask you, what does leading in a crisis bring to mind for you? What does it take to be able to lead in a crisis, in your view?
Well, being from the shipping industry, it takes a number of things. For instance, the crisis may not be in the location you're at, so it takes several things to help. One, I think the biggest key is communications. Communications across all your help, all the impacted individuals, every responder and regulators is key. Without communications, the crisis is becomes just ultimately harder. I look back on what has helped me, and I'll be honest, a sense of humility when you're a crisis leader, because you are working with folks that have been impacted potentially. You're working with excellent folks trying to correct the situation, and again, regulators and politicians. So you want to show and believe that you're doing all you can that's in the best interest for everybody. So that communication is coupled with humility, but you got to throw flexibility in as well. So every crisis changes daily, sometimes hourly, and you just have to be ready to shift, change your plan of attack, and make sure you get the team ready behind you to do that. Those are kind of the three things that I can think of.
Yeah, and the humility aspect of that is something worth repeating here, because it's not something you hear talked about a lot when we think about incident commanders or crisis leaders. And Jeff, I know you've been an incident commander for incidents over the course of your career, but it's fascinating to hear you touch on that, because as I think back on leaders I've worked with, who I really enjoyed working with, that was one of the key factors there, was the humility that they brought into that job and into that room. Everyone was important, and they just checked their ego at the door and were super humble, even as they were managing a very complex organization and response.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I agree. The genuineness is important. You have to want to be a crisis leader, and you have to want to care. And you're right. Some folks may struggle with that, but I think you said checking your ego at the door is absolutely one of the couple of things you're going to hang up as you walk in, because again, you're dealing with folks that are impacted either to a large degree or a small degree, but you want to make sure that you're doing all you can to help them, and then keeping your folks safe while you help.
So if you, in the line of taking care and helping those younger folks coming aboard, what are 2 or 3 things that you would really recommend that a young communicator should do to be ready to respond in the crisis?
It's funny. You may not know you're in a crisis until you're in one, in various roles you may have. And I've often helped coach and maybe mentor folks in their daily jobs. You're trained in crisis techniques and crisis management, and even in the US, the ICS system. You can use that in daily jobs to help learn the system and actually drive maybe better outcomes. So if you're in an operations group, maybe in a refinery or a factory, and something goes wrong, you can actually go through the steps of ICS, and you can resolve that issue instantly there with the folks you have, and it's a training opportunity. I think it's important also, tips for folks coming up is to swap roles frequently if you're active in an incident command system. So just because you run an operations team, maybe at a refinery or again a factory, doesn't mean maybe you're the best suited person for an operations role on an ICS. Logistics may be where you should be, and you may enjoy it more. So I think it's good to swap roles and kind of learn where your niche is. We all have emergency crisis plans in place, from business continuity to oil spill response to earthquake and other natural disaster plans. And it's really important for folks to know those plans. I mean, we have them, they're on the shelf. Pull them down, look through them, because a lot of smart people help put those together, and they're really a usable guide for folks to grab and go. So a lot of companies, I don't think, do that enough. And for young folks wanting to, or for new folks in the crisis community, that's a good thing to do, is to start with knowing the response plans that are in place.
Great. Glad you could share that. So again, the first one is try to coordinate working on ICS on a daily basis, so that when the real thing comes, you're already used to the structure. Swap roles so you find your best fit, which is great advice. And then to know the plans you have. And you're absolutely right. Every client I've worked with has plenty of plans. Most of the time they're not refreshed or they're not read. And so many times they're not actually even coordinated. So I agree with, 3 points there for not just new people in the field, but it's good discipline for everybody.
So Jeff, thinking about, let's talk PIOs for a minute here, public information officer or liaison officers. As an incident commander, kind of looking back on your experiences, what are the characteristics that you think make for a good public information officer or liaison officer, or even an ops section chief for that matter?
Again, I'll start with what I said earlier around humility. A PIO really is kind of leading the outward facing bits and pieces of a response, and this is what the people out there will see when the operations teams and the command staff are grinding away in a command post maybe. So the PIO is an important role, and I think one of the biggest keys there is, and we've seen it in responses, we've seen it when we watch something on television, is knowing your data. There's a lot of information inside a command post, and knowing where to go and to drive consistent use of data and clean data, accurate data, it ultimately will help that PIO in the end, and the ops team. I've seen chaotic times in my past where different data is used, or different data at different times throughout the day is used, and so numbers don't match up, which leads to concerns or angst amongst maybe citizens or politicians or regulators.
Yeah, there's probably a whole episode around data management within a unified command or an incident management team. Just keeping track of the vessels deployed, the boom deployed, the people deployed, all of that. It's a huge logistics challenge, but one that the ICS is sort of designed to manage, but a huge challenge nonetheless.
I think the last bit for all three of the roles you mentioned, PIO, ops section chiefs, and listen, right? I think listening is key. We've seen training films in the past where maybe PIOs might not have listened. If you can stay as long as you possibly can, answer every single question 3 or 4 times, at the end of the day, the response will go easier. The community will feel better. But if we rush through the communication side of providing information to the public, it usually leads to more angst at the end of the day.
Jeff, one other issue that you bring to mind there is just the preparation aspects of doing a press conference, and that because when you're an incident commander and potentially going out to stand in front of a phalanx of television cameras, being prepared for that is quite a challenge. And in my experience, in most incidents, there's just not a lot of time to prepare an incident commander for a press conference. But I was curious your experience in that for the incidents and exercises that you've worked. Did you feel prepared to step out and do that?
So I'd say there were times where I did, and probably more times where I didn't, honestly. But I look back on what happens during a busy day in the command post, and I think one of the common issues we see is your command staff, be it federal, state, if you're in the U.S., and of course the responsible party, they get sidelined into continual stream of meetings. One of the things I always like to do is book time on the meeting schedule for us to be out and on the floor and talking and seeing what people are working on. Look at the graphics that are being developed. Look at the information sheets that are out that are being developed by the teams on the floor, because ultimately, when you get asked the question in a press conference, that extra 15 minutes giving yourself, just being on the floor and talking to folks and understanding what they're working with will go a long way in helping you in a press conference. Much more than, you know, being handed a couple of pages of bullet points to repeat. I think you really need to know the response and know what's happening, which is difficult at times given the stress and the timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And the number of meetings that incident commanders required to attend on a daily basis. So schedule or, you know, calendar management is a really important point that you've raised there. And we coach that into sections all the time, as if you've got something that you're going to need the incident commander in, you need to get that on the schedule so we can make time for it, and then make time for preparation as well. So yeah, really excellent point.
Yeah. And you're really talking about what used to be called the Hewlett-Packard way, where it was management by wandering around. Just
Absolutely.
taking enough time to know what's happening. I made a little note while you were talking, because from what you're saying, it's possible that when the JIC brings up a press release or a new statement, that, as you're describing, it's possible that may mention some things that you might not have seen before if you're not out there seeing what's being developed and so on. So all the more important that review and approval process occurs. And I'll have a question about that later. But real quickly, you've talked about what are the characteristics of a good PIO or section leader, but let's flip the table a bit and say, what are some of the mistakes you've seen made in some of your exercises or in the actual events, either by PIO or by the incident commander, or again, as Tom mentioned, by a section? No names, of course.
Yeah, no names, but I think they're all lessons learned, right? So at the end of the day, well, I'd have been deemed a mistake or one of those I wish I would have done better moments. You know, I think not answering questions or not staying long enough to answer a full gambit of questions. You know, when a press conference is given 20 minutes, but there's 30 minutes worth of questions in the room, you know, that's real important that you might want to stick around and be able to field some of those further questions, because at the end of the day, that'll help, again, with the public information. So I think that's one of the bigger issues I've seen is we rush through a press conference and we leave people wanting more.
Right.
And then that bites us in the backside at the end of the day, because in a vacuum, people will come up with their own information. Right. So I think that's one of the bigger issues I've seen. And then, you know, I talked a bit about the data, you know, knowing where to get the data and consistent use of it. I think back to a time where I was in an actual response, and there was a team of folks walking around a very large command post, and you know, they were federal officials, and they came up to my section. I think I was in logistics at the time, and they said, "We need this information now for POTUS." And well, POTUS isn't a word I'd used very much in my career, honestly. And I realized that, you know, here at 2 p.m, our data set might have been set at 8 a.m, and it'll be coming out at 6 p.m. at night. But, you know, they're looking at information to give to the president that is going to be off cycle for the information that we've been sharing publicly. So in that moment, I quickly went and found the PIO and said, "Hey, we got people asking, can you help usher them through?" But they just wandered around as they're allowed to, and came across our graphics boards in our little section, and we're writing things down feverishly. And across the day, that information had changed since we'd last posted it publicly. So that's one of the fears that I've seen come true.
Good point.
Cool. Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, the sort of demands for information are constant, but the organization that's running the response, the management team, they've got to be able to have time to develop that information, verify it, and then make it available for public information uses and that. And that's a forever challenge within a command post, right? Is getting the latest information and verified information. So there's real challenges there. And that's why we often fall back on the infamous 209 form, which hopefully is updated twice a day. And that, what's your experience with, with that, Jeff, in terms of, information accuracy and being able to get accurate information, especially early on?
Well, it in the early stages, in the reactionary stage, information's flowing in quickly in some cases, and in some cases not at all. You may have a section of a response where we've got live TV feed, we've got people on the ground calling in, and then there might be a section that's quite remote and we haven't heard from folks in 4 hours. So it's kind of a mixed bag what we've seen. But at the end of the day, the challenge is, of course, is how do we react and report that out and deal with it. And again, in the reactionary stage, when we're first standing up, it's tough, but you have to recognize it. I think as we go into response and we settle in, having that agreement with if you're in the U.S., the unified command as to times for data approvals and which data set is correct. Like you mentioned, the 209 form, getting that approval amongst the unified command and the agencies that are there, that this will be the Bible of information, goes a long way. So I've seen in the past where maybe we rush through that and nobody agrees that this is the set of stone tablets that we'll use moving forward of information. And it does create hardship in the future if we don't.
Right. We actually saw that in one actual event down here on the California coast. The JEC actually got permission from Unified Command to turn the 209 into a daily update listing that you could keep multiple dates on. So stakeholders could look and see the difference in birds or boom and so on. And it became automatic, and that as quickly as Unified Command accepted the new 209, it was immediately available to post. And that seemed to be really helpful because it then gave more time at that press conference to talk about why all those events are occurring or why you're doing what you're doing. And it seemed to really help with that. And it helped, especially with, back to your comment that virtually every press conference script I've seen and in many actual events, there's always that escape hatch for Unified Command after about 20 minutes. And so that's great advice to at least use that 20 minutes widely, but maybe stay put a bit longer. And if you can't, at least leave the PIO there.
Yeah, it goes a long way. And if you can afford the time, it's time well spent for sure.
Right.
Hey, Jeff, little softball question here. What's as you think about the incidents you've worked and the exercises you've worked, I wonder if you have kind of a pet peeve, things that bother you, that you see, sort of behaviors you see in an exercise or even in an actual response, that people should watch out for and try to avoid.
Yeah, and I think fortunately my list isn't very long. I mean, I think there's an external piece that most folks are disgusted with, and that's where maybe we see fraud occurring. But I don't want to speak to that. I think for me, one of my biggest pet peeves is, we assemble a structure of, let's talk unified command, and you've got the right people in the room. And those are folks that, in all senses, are delegated all the authorities they need to help with the response and make the response move forward. And more often than not, we slowly find that maybe it's not the right people in the room, and maybe that FOSC or state on-scene coordinator has to make calls before they can make decisions. And that really, while we allow it, it does slow things down, and it does kind of muddle the effectiveness of a unified command. So if I could just put one kind of stick in the ground around what I think kind of upsets me a bit, like you said, a pet peeve, it would be having the wrong people in decision-making roles that aren't delegated the authority to do so.
Yeah, that sounds like a very frustrating operating environment there. And then of course you have to kind of work around those individuals in order to get things done. Yeah, sounds like a very frustrating place to be. How about in crisis exercises? Anything you see in exercises? And one of the things I'll throw out is when people just play to the exercise, and they're sort of they're in the room and they're doing things, but they're not really taking it seriously as a good way to practice.
Yeah, you see that. Yeah, I agree with you, Tom. You see that regularly, and you see it across all groups, command and general staff. You see it from regulators, politicians, responders. It's a great opportunity to roll up our sleeves, figure out what we're not doing well and fix it. But oftentimes, those drills are, unfortunately, they're graded, I guess is the best way to say it. So under an environment where we're practicing as hard as we can, but there's a pass-fail component to it, a lot of times you will see, maybe some folks playing to the microphone, so to speak, but, if you dive deep, you'll see that maybe they're not doing what they should be doing. So if it's a pass-fail environment, sometimes you lose some of that training credibility. I get it. Drills are required. Drills, prove your response capabilities. But, oftentimes we forget that they're training environment and we can learn from them. So I usually try to stress that, but there are times when it's truly a pass-fail.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and since both of you shared, I've got one that always sticks with me, and that is when the regulators don't show up to be a part of the drill they're requiring. That's always a frustration when you're supposed to be learning how to work together and introducing ideas and processes. And then some of the people that you would be in the room with a national event just for whatever reason just can't be there. And to me, that's a real challenge.
Yeah, we've seen that happen, and it is unfortunate, right? Because it's not only their personal training, because the next time maybe a true incident occurs, that person is now a state on scene coordinator and really hasn't got much practice at it, right?
Right.
So
it's an opportunity wasted.
Definitely.
Can we ask you one more thing about wearing your incident commander hat? PIO shows up with a document for approval. What advice can you give for getting that approval process to happen in one swoop instead of present, revise, present, revise, present, revise, the death cycle that we can get into?
Oh, yeah, it's a spiral. I've seen it, and it's frustrating for everybody. One of the things that in the shipping side of the business that I used and shamelessly stole from somebody else was we delegate authorities as incident commander. We had several deputies. So in my past, we'd always have a command staff deputy and a general staff deputy. So if operations or logistics had questions, and maybe incident commanders on a site visit or in a meeting, that person has full delegation and authority to respond as if they were the incident commander. And what that does is that helps, especially for the deputy incident commander on command staff, it helps work with the PIO. So by the time it walks through the command, unified command room, it's done. And we encourage in responses and in drills that our colleagues maybe on the unified command do the same. And for the most part, they try. But I think sometimes that slowdown process occurs maybe at a state level where they haven't followed that same practice.
Sure.
We like to think it was a best practice to have multiple deputies just filling in and sorting things so that it did speed that process up. And when it worked great. It worked really
Right.
great, Mark.
Right. Well, and that's also training your next incident commanders, which is great. I was at an exercise in Texas with your guys' alma mater, where one of the injects were the command had gone up for an overflight and their plane was forced down. So they weren't back in incident command in time for the next round of decisions and briefings and so on. And that was a very significant wrench in the works because a lot of people in the room just weren't ready to step into those roles. So what you
Yeah,
said
and you quick,
is a great prevention of that.
and in that, it's a great test. And in that moment, you quickly find who is ready as well, right?
Right.
So I'd encourage that. I've seen exercises, thinking back to my shipboard days where maybe the chief engineer who's accountable for, starting the fire pump doesn't show up. So now the second engineer, third engineer has to figure it out. So I think it's a great training tool to use. But yeah, sometimes, you either show the world that you're not ready or you see some greatness in some of your folks.
Right. And in addition to that, it gives you that time to wander around.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Jeff, I had the opportunity to work a very large crisis where the incident commander actually followed that process you just talked about, where they appointed deputies. And I was just so thankful and so amazed at how that simplified the approval process, because there was somebody always available then to get the latest FAQ or the latest press release approved, and we could get it out the door quickly. So I really grab onto that as a best practice. And thanks for sharing that and reminding me about that, because that's something that I'd like to see more of in more exercises and actual unified commands. I've got one. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, and like Mark alluded to, it kind of kills two birds with one stone. You're training your future deputy. Your deputies are now training to be incident commanders, and you don't frustrate all the process and slow it down needlessly. Yeah.
So one final question for you here today, Jeff. I was thinking about sort of international incident planning, and you mentioned your stint working in Singapore. And of course, shipping, involves vehicles that are moving from port to port. And so you've got to be prepared to manage an incident kind of anywhere around the world that a ship might be going. How difficult, how challenging is that process? And what did you find that sort of worked for you as you were thinking through those issues?
Yeah, I remember just having a conversation with a refinery manager one time, and I said, when you went to bed at 10 o'clock last night, you knew where the refinery was, and when you woke up at 8 in the morning, it was still right where you left it. And unfortunately for us, that ship moves, and they move all over the world. So you're absolutely right that the challenges are huge for us in that from a shipping company perspective, typically it's small groups of folks in teams located globally. So in the US, maybe a shipping company might have 20 people in an office, and maybe in Europe they might have the same, and maybe in Asia. That's not a lot of people, spread across those three areas that can instantly help, and not all of them are trained to respond. So what you really need are good partners, good organizations that you've contracted with, and visit them as much as you can. I've always liked to be able to know my regulators, but in a global scale, that's really not possible. You can't really go around the world and meet everybody you may end up sitting across the table from in an incident. So I think it's important to have good partners. If you've got oil spill response organizations with global reach, they do a lot of that for you. So be active with those. And responses aren't typically, it could be anything from, a natural disaster to, an environmental incident. But we've even had, human issues where maybe somebody unfortunately passes away while on board a ship, maybe of natural causes. But, having the right connections to respond to that, it's no different than a big response you might see in an environment, because you've got to figure out how to move people around the world, how to respond. And you end up with a very large Rolodex of response agencies that will help. And I think that's the biggest piece to it. Now, if you're part of a larger organization, you can really lean on other business units within it. So I'm thinking naturally, maybe an oil company. And you can rely on employees maybe in another country to help. But, in most cases, shipping companies just don't have that. And they're running 20 ships around the world, and they might have a total shoreside crew of 20. So it becomes a challenge.
Yeah, it's fascinating on that. All right, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today, Jeff. Really appreciate you taking time and sharing some of your many experiences in the shipping world as an incident commander and as a shipboard staff. So thank you again for that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, Tom and Mark, it's my pleasure. And it's an important topic, and I'm glad you're doing this.
Great. Well,
Yes, thank you for that.
And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Leading in a Crisis podcast. We'll be back next week with some new content for you. Please like and subscribe this and tell your friends about us as well. Thanks, and we'll talk to you again soon.